morning. I'm Jo Chamberlain, the Executive Director of the Coastside Land Trust. Welcome to the native bees of California, specific to our coastal pollination, one of many in a series of educational webinars that we've presented. Before I get started here and turn it over to our guest speakers, a little bit of housekeeping. All of our webinars, including this one, are posted on our website, and you will be able to just go there anytime and view these. And for today's registrants, you'll be receiving a link to the webinar by Monday, if not before. And the logistics today is we'll have our presentation, and then it'll be followed by a Q&A. If you have questions, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A. Please type your questions in there, and our presenters will address your questions after their formal presentation. Please, if you can, help us fund these webinars, and your continued financial and in-person support is very important to us, and we're grateful to have all of you with us. So on to today's presentation. We have two very excellent presenters on native bees. Our first person who will do the formal presentation is Sarah Caso. She's in her third year of study at UC Berkeley, and she's concentrating on conservation biology and agriculture. Recently, her focus has been on native insects at the UC Berkeley Urban Bee Lab. And she's also an undergraduate research assistant at this Urban Bee Lab. So she's quite a knowledgeable and in-depth student, even in just her third year. So she'll do our formal presentation. And then we also have with us Dr. Gordon Frankie, who is a professor emeritus at University of California, Berkeley. His specialty has been in ecology and the behavior of native bees in California and Costa Rica. And he has worked with native bees and concerned primarily at this point with the goal of working toward conserving bees and other insects in association with plants and the human and environmental community. So we're delighted to have both of these excellent presenters with us today. And both of you, if you'd like to add a little more about your experience and involvement, please don't hesitate to do so. This was a very brief introduction for each of you. So at this point, please join me in welcoming Sarah Caso of presenting Native Bees of California. Sarah?
Hi, welcome everyone, good morning. Yeah, so today I'll be talking to you about the native bees of California. And I'll be teaching you a lot, but really I'm just hoping to help foster an appreciation of bees. And maybe if you already, appreciate bees, maybe you'll love them even more by the end of the presentation. So here's a brief outline of our presentation. So I'm going to start by talking about the diversity of bees, going through anatomy and all that, and then I'll talk about ecology and some taxonomy before I get into the importance of bees and why it's important to help with bee conservation. And so then I'll explain a bit why we're doing bee conservation, because of declines of pollinator populations. Then I'll get into exactly what we do to help bees, what we do with our bee lab, and then what you all can do. And before I begin, I just want to point out I have slide numbers on most of my slides. And so since we're answering questions at the end, if you have a question about a specific slide or you want me to go back to a specific slide for a question, you can include a slide number, and that'll be really helpful for Dr. Frankie, since I'll be working the actual presentation slides. Okay, onto the diversity of bees. Okay, so before I talk about bees, I want to make sure we all know what bees look like. So bees, wasps, and flies are often confused with one another. So here are some of the main differences between them so you can help differentiate what you're seeing. So one of the key differences between bees and flies is that bees have 2 pairs of wings and flies only have 1. And bees also have stingers, but flies will not sting you. And then another easy way to tell if you're looking at a bee or maybe it's a hoverfly is that hoverflies, like their name implies, tend to hover around flowers, whereas bees will just go straight to the flower. And then bees and wasps are a bit harder to differentiate visually, especially because they're both of the same order, Hymenoptera, and it's believed that bees evolved from wasps. So they're very visually similar, but it can be easy to tell a difference if maybe the bee or the wasp is eating, because wasps are in general carnivorous. So they'll eat meat and you'll only see bees on flowers. And then another common difference between bees and wasps is that bees are often hairy and wasps are not usually hairy. And then I also want to take this time to point out that wasps are also very beneficial insects. They're great for insect management. And it's really only a few that will give us trouble, namely yellow jackets. And some wasps are even pollinators. Okay, onto bee anatomy and physiology. So more into what bees look like. Bees may look like they're pretty simple organisms, but they're pretty complex. They have nervous system, respiratory system, digestive system. And I think one of the coolest things about their anatomy is that they have 5 eyes, and 3 of these are simple eyes on the top of their head. And they have a single lens to focus light, and they're used to help bees orient themselves using sunlight. And then their compound eyes on the side of their face, you can see here, are used to detect depth and distance to help fly, and they can see polarized light. And then I'm just gonna quickly move to this slide before I come back, because bees, as I just mentioned, see the world differently than us. They can see UV light. So this on the right is an example of a sunflower in a simulated bee vision. And you can see that they can see what's called a bullseye or a landing pad. And some flowers have evolved to have this to help direct bees towards nectar. Okay, and then back to anatomy. So as I mentioned before, most bees are hairy, which helps them collect pollen. And this is done using electrical charges. So when bees fly, their hairs collect a positive charge, which then attracts negatively charged pollen. And then they also have hair all over their body, which tells them about air pressure and humidity. And then their antenna. These are really important because they're sensory organs, and bees, like many insects, rely on their sensory receptors. And so the antennae sense the odors of the environment to help them find flowers and orient them when they're flying. And then, of course, the proboscis. It's like a coming together of structures, and it's kind of like a straw. So it's a hollow tube that bees will use to suck up nectar from flowers. And then, last but not least, bees use their mandibles, which are here. This is a honeybee, so you can't see mandible, but they use mandibles to carry materials and construct nests. Okay, onward to diversity. So now that we have an idea of what bees look like, how many types of bees are there? So the most recent calculation puts a global estimate about 20,000 species, which is a lot, but the number is probably closer to 30,000. There's just not a lot of research on bee species, specifically in Asia and Africa. And then within the United States here, we have about 3,600, and specifically within the US alone, California alone, we have 1,600, which is the most out of any other state. And so California has so many different bee species because it has such a wide variety of habitats. And also we have a very long growing season here. So growing season in California is 10.5 months, which means that December is actually the start of bee season. And you can see bumblebees pollinating manzanita. Okay. Now I'll tell you a bit about some bee behavior before I go into specifics of different bee species, so you have an understanding of some of the common behaviors of bees. So most bees are generalists, which just means they're going to pollinate any flower. On the other hand, specialists are specialized on pollen, which means they feed on select plants for the pollen, not the nectar. And this is more common in the tropics, with some bees specialized on certain flowers, like orchid bees with orchids. I also have some examples from the US here. There's specialists on squash and sunflowers. Okay, another behavior that I just want to go into really quickly is whether a bee is social or solitary. So most bees are solitary bees. Around 95% of bees in California are solitary bees. But social bees are the bees that people tend to know about. So these are bumblebees and honeybees. And so these two types of bees are eusocial, which means that they have a division of labor and they have cooperative brood care. Whereas solitary bees nest individually and they don't provision brood cells. So once a female bee lays her egg, she does not stick around to care for the brood once it hatches in the following year. And it's also important to note that while we have like these two divisions of social and solitary, some solitary bees will exhibit some characteristics of social bees. Okay, and then on to some common myths that people have, just to dispel some myths that you may have about bees before I get more into depth. So number one, bees do not all have hives. So as I just mentioned, most bees are solitary bees, and so they have their own nests. And then next, male bees often will sleep on flowers or stems, so they won't sleep in a nest or a hive. And so right here on the right, we have some bees sleeping on flowers and some more on a stem, which are really adorable. And then number three, so only honeybees will die after stinging, and this is because their stinger has barbs which rip out the stinger from its abdomen when it stings someone. Whereas native bees don't die after stinging. And on the same train of thought, only female bees can sting because the stinger is a modified ovipositor. And so ovipositors are what females use to lay eggs. So only female bees will sting. And then number four, bees live a long time. So most species do not live a long time. Most native bees are only alive for a few weeks. Male bees generally have a shorter lifespan, and female bees live a few weeks longer. And honeybees and bumblebees live longer due to their social lifestyle. Okay, number five. So male bees do pollinate. They're just not as efficient pollinators as female bees. Since female bees are collecting pollen and nectar for their brood cells, they pollinate many more flowers, right? Male bees are just pollinating flowers when they're collecting nectar for themselves. However, it's also important to note that pollination is just the contamination of flowers by bees when they're carrying pollen on their bodies. So it's not like female bees are knowingly pollinating flowers, are just taking advantage of their collecting. Okay, and then finally, only honeybees make honey. And in fact, many things that you may know about bees, which are common knowledge, like the waggle dance or male bees dying after mating, are specific to honeybees, not native bees. And so also, while bumblebees make a nectar concoction because they're social bees, this isn't anything like honey from honeybees. So only honeybees make honey. Okay, on to bee species. So these next two slides are to give you an idea of just how wide the variety of bees are here in California. As I mentioned, California has 1,600 species, and they're all very different. So here is an example of the different sizes of bees. So on the left, we have a small carpenter bee. On the right, we have a valley carpenter bee. And the bee on the right is often called the teddy bear bee because the males are this light brown orangish color, and they're very fuzzy. And also male bees don't sting, so they're like teddy bears. But it's only male valley carpenter bees. Female valley carpenter bees are all black. And then what's interesting here is that this bee is actually nectar robbing. And so many large bees will do what's called nectar robbing, which is where they'll just poke a hole in the flower near the base and suck the nectar out. And so they're not really pollinating the flowers. And so while the small carpenter bee may be a lot smaller, small bees are also really important pollinators. Okay, and onto some different coloring. So on the left is a green sweat bee. And this is actually a male green sweat bee because it has black and yellow stripes on its abdomen, and females are all green. And then on the right here, we have a mason bee, which I think is a really beautiful iridescent blue. And so just a fun fact, sweat bees are aptly called sweat bees because in the South or the tropics where it's really humid, they'll land on people and lick the sweat off of them. Okay, and before I'm gonna talk about some species specifically, I just wanna run through the families of bees. So these first 5, Apidae, Andrenidae, Coletidae, Halictidae, and Megachilidae are all, yeah. And then the last family, Stenotrididae, is the smallest family of bees, and it only has 21 species, and these are only found in Australia. Okay, on to my favorite part. I'm gonna walk you through some different bee genera. So I'm gonna start with the bee that is not native to California, just because everyone knows about it and everyone always wants to know about honeybees. And so honeybees were brought to California in the 1850s. And nowadays, most of the honeybees used in the US come from Italy. And so honeybees are active year-round because they're social and live in hives. And as I mentioned before, they have a caste system. And so worker bees are all female and they cannot reproduce, only the queen can reproduce. And so, yes. Oh, also I wanted to point out, as I continue, I have the family up in the left corner, and I also have a size reference here in the lower right corner. So you can have an idea of the sizes of the bees I'm talking about. Okay, onward. Onto the much loved bumblebee. So bumblebees are social and their queens are active from December to November, and then the workers will come out in January and last until November. And in California, there are 27 different species of bumblebees, and some will have hives underground, others have hives above ground, and so they often like to go in bird nest boxes. Onto Ceratina. So I mentioned small carpenter bees before, and so these bees are active from spring to summer, and they emerge in April and last until August. There are 13 different species here in California, and as I mentioned before, it's not really important that they're small because they're really, really effective pollinators. And so while these are generalists, they often visit Asteraceae and Limiciae, and they also commonly nest in the stems of berries, asters, and mints. Okay, on to Diadasia, which are, I think, some of the cutest bees. You can see this one here, a mallow-loving digger bee. It's really fuzzy and has these really vibrant, like light blue-green eyes. And so Diadasia have a range of April to August, and there are 20 different species here in California. And they are specialists. They specialize on mallow, sunflower, prickly pear, and morning glory. And so hence they are very commonly seen on sunflowers and cactus. And like most bees of California, they're ground nesters. So 70% of bees in California are ground nesters, and the other 30% are a mixture of mostly twig and trunk nesters. Okay, Eucera are an early season bee, and they emerge in March and are around until June. There are 23 different species here in California, and they collect pollen on their hind legs. They nest solitarily in soil, and they're generative. And here we have a picture of a spring longhorn bee. And now we have more longhorn bees. This is a summer longhorn bee, and Melisodes are called longhorn bees, and they have, this is a male longhorn bee, and they have really long antennae in order to help orient itself in order to find females. And so then the female Melisodes have shorter antennae. And these bees are around from May to September, and there are 50 different species in California. And so while they sometimes nest in groups, let me take a sip of water. They're still solitary bees. So this means that each bee will make her own nest, but maybe if an area has really good dirt or good flowers, there are going to be many different bees congregating in the same area, but they're still going to have their own nest there. Yes, okay, and then on to Agapostemon. So I mentioned them before, these are the sweat bees. And so here again, we have a male sweat bee, which you can differentiate because it has a striped abdomen with black and yellow. And this is the female because she is all green. And so sweat bees are out from March to October, and they have only 5 species in California, but they're the most common solitary native bee. And so these bees are ground nesting, and the female actually overwinters as an adult and then emerges. Okay, now we have Xeromelecta, which are really interesting bees. There are only 2 species here in California, and they're around from July to October. And what's so interesting is that they are called cuckoo bees because, like cuckoo birds, they're parasitic. So instead of like having their own nest, they will lay eggs in the nest of other solitary bees. And so since they don't care for their own broods, This means that they're often hairless on their abdomen because they don't need to collect pollen, because their young will feed on the pollen of other bees. And so they only will visit flowers for nectar. And worldwide, cuckoo bees make about 15% of all bees, and there are a lot of these bees in California and Costa Rica. Okay, and last but not least, we have megachile. And these bees are the cutest, and I think you'll agree with me after the next 2 slides. So these bees emerge in May and around through September, and there's 75 different species in California. And unlike other bees I've just gone over, they collect pollen on the underside of their abdomen. And this right here is a megachile fidelis, whose underside is filled with pollen. And so the hairs on the abdomen of these bees are special for collecting pollen, and male bees do not have those hairs. And so what's so adorable about these bees is that they are leaf cutter bees, so they cut leaves and flowers to construct nests. And so here on the left, we have one who has a leaf cutting, and on the right are some examples of the little brood cells or nests that are lined with flower petals. And so these bees have a gland that allows them to secrete a liquid that's like a glue to glue leaves and petals together to make nests. And so I want to point out, because I've gotten questions on what you can do if you have these bees visiting your garden and you don't want them to be cutting your leaves or flower petals, you should really just appreciate that you do have these bees visiting you. They're not going to take all of your leaves and your flowers. They're little bees. And you should really just be happy to see this process happening, because it's pretty magnificent. Okay, we're through the longest section. Everything else runs pretty quickly for now. So now that you hopefully love bees because they're adorable, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why they're so important. So what do bees do? Bees are pollinators, and pollinators pollinate 75% of flowering plants, and the majority of those plants that are dependent on pollinators are pollinated by bees. And within agriculture, over 100 main crops are pollinated by bees. And they'll get into that in a second, but bees are just really important within our ecosystem. They're essential for keeping ecosystems biodiverse and keeping plant life balanced. So yes, important for agriculture, but also just important for nature in general. But on to their agricultural importance. So 1/3 of the food that we eat is pollinated by bees. Obviously, this is going to vary a little bit depending on your diet, whatever you eat. But more than 1/3 of the crops produced in the US require insect pollination. And so this ranges from livestock forage, so that meat and dairy products are reliant upon bees, and timber for construction, to medicines derived from plants. And native bees specifically are essential for tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, because this requires a special pollination process called buzz pollination. And so these native bees will shake pollen free from flowers by vibrating the anthers to release the pollen. And this is done by bumblebees, carpenter bees, and some flower bees. And so honeybees, which are often used in our agricultural system, cannot perform buzz pollination. Okay, and I really just want to emphasize agricultural importance, because I think if I just say 100 main crops, maybe you don't really have an idea of what that means. What are those crops? So here are just a few examples. And I want to point your attention to coffee right here in the middle. It's the morning. Maybe you've already had some coffee. Maybe you're going to drink some coffee later. So coffee is pollinated by bees. I'll just give you a second to read over this list. All right. And so unfortunately, insect populations have been declining. So in this section, I'm going to quickly go over what's going on and why this is so devastating. Okay, so the most recent study on insect population declines was done in Germany, which found a 75% decline in insect populations over 27 years, which is a massive loss. And so this translates to 40% of insect pollinators globally having a threatened population. And so one of the main problems we have is that there's not a lot of data being collected on insect populations or bee populations. But for bee species with sufficient data, 52% are showing population declines, so half of them, and then 24% of those are in serious peril, so about a quarter. And specifically, honeybee populations have been falling off for about 10 years now. And just on the right, you can get an idea of when I say there's not a lot of research and information available. So right here within the United States, you can see 92%, we just don't have enough information on. Okay, so why is this happening? There are a multitude of factors. And so with all these compounding on each other, it's just devastating. So some of these individual factors are habitat destruction. So this is a loss of the quantity and quality of food available for bees, and it also results in a reduced nesting area for bees. And then habitat fragmentation, which is just a large area of land being divided into smaller pieces. So maybe now that area has 2 roads running through it, so it's fragmented. This results in lower species richness and again, reduced nesting area. Another huge factor is pesticide use. And I want to point out this is both insecticides and herbicides. And so recently, a study has found Roundup to be particularly devastating for bumblebees. It's really hard to do research on pesticides just because there's so many different native bee species and don't know how it's going to impact every single different species and all of that, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to do research on that. Next, a huge factor is climate change. So in some areas, temperatures are exceeding the tolerances that these bees have adapted to live in. It's going to push these bees out of their native habitats and so forth. So that's devastating populations. Another big one is introduced species. So bringing in non-native and then potentially invasive species, you're bringing in pathogens, you're also changing the native habitat for these bees. And then finally, disease and mites. So there are lots of diseases that we don't know of. Here are just 2 examples. We have Nosema, which impacts honey and bumblebees, and then chalk brood is devastating for alfalfa leaf-cutting bees. Yes, so now that I've just told you some pretty sad information, how do we help bees? Okay, number 1, stopping pesticide use. So this is both insecticides and herbicides. We don't really have specifics on what each individual pesticide is doing to bees, also different insecticides and herbicides together can have compounding effects. There's just a huge multitude of factors involved. Another thing that's really important to helping bees is preserving native habitats. And then in addition to preserving native habitats, creating pollinator gardens with lots of flowers and lots of diversity to help bee populations. And then of course, all of you guys here are doing this already, but educating yourself on bees, and then also taking that information and educating others. And so here's some book resources really quickly. So this is Dr. Frankie's book. And so maybe this presentation has piqued your interest in bees and you want to learn more scientific information and more about gardening for bees. And so, of course, I recommend Dr. Frankie's book, California Bees and Blooms. And if you have any specific questions about it, you can ask Dr. Frankie himself after I finish this presentation. And then some more really good books for just for, that are maybe less scientific, easier reads. I really recommend The Good Bee. It's a really short, really quick book. It's also like a really light read. There's lots of images and stories, and it has good basic information on different bees. And then if you want a book that's maybe not so light, a little sadder, but also a very excellent book, I recommend Silent Earth. It talks about many different insects within it, but it has really great information on bees. And also, if you don't have time, if you're interested in these and you don't have time to write down the name and everything, we're going to be sending this information out at the end of the presentation. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I'm an undergraduate research assistant at the UC Berkeley Urban Bee Lab, and this is Dr. Frankie's lab, of course. So I'm going to mention what we do really quickly, because maybe you're wondering, I mentioned before, we don't have a lot of research on bees. So what research is being done? So at our lab, one of the things we do is right now, currently, we're working with different farms. And so we're working in Brentwood with some berry farms, and also in Ventura with avocado farms. And this right here is Jim Lloyd Butler farm in Ventura. And this is one of our pollinator gardens. And so one of the things we do is we propagate plants here at our lab, and then we create pollinator habitats. And so we're doing this to help supplement, help boost native bee populations in agriculture. So maybe this will decrease the use of truck and honeybees in agriculture, and also help boost native bee populations in general. And so then what we do with this back at the lab is that we'll go to these different gardens and we'll do bee collections. And so then here on the right, the rightmost image is an example of one of our collections. And so what we do is we collect information like the date, the location, who collected it, what plant was it on, what bee species is it, and then we database this information. So then we have an idea of what bee species we're finding in different places, what are the favorite flowers of these bees, and so forth. And within time, maybe we're seeing more bee species, maybe we're seeing more bees, and so forth. So we can get an idea of what's going on with bee populations. Okay, last but not least, I'm gonna run through, I mentioned before, one of the things you can do to help bee populations, probably the most important thing you can do is create a pollinator habitat. So I'm gonna run through this really quickly. Maybe not everyone here is a gardener or is into gardening or has gardened before. So I'm gonna go through some really basic information. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, do not feel overwhelmed. I'm going through everything. And also, I'm gonna have some examples, and don't feel like you need to have every single flower. What's most important is that you do the best with what you can. Maybe you can only have one plant. That's okay. You have one plant now, and that's helping. Okay, so what's most important is that you're going to provide diverse food sources. So bees and other pollinators need food sources year round. So bees will use pollen for protein and nectar for carbohydrates. So you want to have both pollen and nectar. And so it's important, if you're going to have a garden, it's important that you're going to have plants that bloom at different times throughout the year. And some may be providing nectar, some may be providing pollen, and some will have a combination of pollen and nectar. And I also want to point out that maybe you have weeds in front of your house, and if you're seeing bees on them, consider leaving them because they're an important food source. And then you don't have to maintain your own garden. Okay, and this is just an idea. If you are interested in gardening, I'm gonna have this later on, but on our website, we have really thorough information. And so this is just an idea of, it's an infographic we have of when you're gonna want to have the most plants, May and June, and what type of plants you're gonna want. So you're gonna want mostly plants most of the time. Okay, and just for an idea of all of the different flowers that you can plant, here are two natives. We have California lilac and manzanita, and then also bees cannot differentiate between native and non-native flowers, so they're going to visit non-native flowers. And so here are two that they like. These are early flowering plants, so early season, wisteria and pride of Madeira. And then some summer flowering plants. We have buckwheat and gum plant and phacelia. So as I mentioned before, it's important to have diversity of nectar versus pollen and nectar. So some plants that only provide nectar: lavender, catnip, brandegee sage. Some that only provide pollen, we have California poppy and common yarrow. And then I'm just gonna go through some specific flowers and what bees they're going to attract. So we have philomelic, and bumblebees, mason bees, and digger bees really love this flower. Goldenrod is much loved by sweat bees, summer longhorn bees, and bumblebees. Currants are well loved by digger bees and bumblebees and carpenter bees. You can see a very cute bumblebee visiting flower. And then I've mentioned manzanita before, and so this is a really great early season plant. And mason bees, bumblebees, Habropoda, and Anthophora really love manzanita. And then almost done here. Ceanothus is also a really important plant for early season bees, and specifically leafcutter bees, hairy belly bees, bumblebees, and small carpenter bees. Oops, sorry. Gum plant, also great for leafcutter bees, longhorn bees, green sweat bees, and other sweat bees. And this is a great mid to late summer plant. That was a lot of gardening information right there. And so a lot to throw at you. If you're interested in that sort of stuff, I recommend you visit our website, and we have all of the bee plants listed out. We have whether they're native or not, if they're pollen or nectar, and then maybe you're looking for a specific bee species that you really want. We have what bee species visit them too. Okay, and it's also important to include a water source. And so while most bees don't need water, ground nesting bees, some of them will use water to soften dirt and create their nests. So it's really important to have a water source. And then also if you're gonna include water, you wanna make sure that you have stones or some sort of floating vegetation for bees to land on so that they won't accidentally drown. And then last but not least, provide shelter. So when I say provide shelter, I don't mean that you need to build a bee hotel. I just mean that maybe you're going to leave some uncovered patches of soil and sand for ground nesting bees, some different soil types. You're going to leave some woody debris in your yard, maybe an old log, and leave like dead flowers in your yard. You don't necessarily clean everything up because bees will use that. But maybe you are interested in creating a bee hotel. And so this is not an easy task. I just want to say like upfront, it's a lot of responsibility. You don't want to have too many holes in the hotel because that's in nature, all these bees aren't necessarily going to be living on their like that close together. So you don't want it to be very large. And then you don't want to keep it in the direct sun, but also not in the shade, like fully in the shade. And you also need to keep it out of rain so it doesn't get moldy. And then you also can't clean bee hotels too often because there are brood cells in there and you don't want to accidentally kill any broods that are left in there. But it's also important that you are going to be cleaning out sometimes just because it will attract other insects like spiders, and spiders are predators of bees. So you can create a solitary bee hotel, just know that it's a lot of work. And some other quick tips before I wrap this up. As I mentioned before, you're going to want to clean it. A bee hotel, like maybe replace the tubes, but again, don't replace the tubes if there are bees still in them. And then, so if you are interested in creating pollinator garden, we advise planting larger patches of flowers because bees prefer to visit plots that are at least 1 meter in diameter. And you're going to want to plant at least 10 plants, ideally 15 to 20 with bee plants for both spring and summer. Again, avoid pesticides. And then I mentioned before that you're going to want to leave some uncovered soil. And this is because a mulch will prevent ground nesting bees from nesting. So you want to avoid using a lot of mulch. So you can use mulch, just not everywhere. And this is a very complex example, but it's just to give you an idea of what can be done. If you're not a gardener, don't feel overwhelmed by this. I mentioned before, what's important is that you make do with what you have. I live in Berkeley. I don't have space for a pollinator garden. I have a few lavender and rosemary plants out front, and I see bees on them all the time. If you only have room for a few, maybe in front of your house, that's great. Don't feel like you have to make a huge pollinator garden. This is just an idea of what you can do that we have on our website. All right, thank you so much for listening. Dr. Frankie is going to answer questions now. If you haven't posted any questions and you have them, feel free to post them now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. What a great presentation. And we have a whole bunch of questions to follow what you've shared today. And I actually wanted to start off with Christina. She asked a question. She was wanting to know about a recommendation on a book for identifying native bees in California in the Bay Area, and thought specifically, I think this just is a good segue to introduce Dr. Gordon Frankie. And I know we introduced him at the beginning, but he's going to be sort of leading the questions. He and Sarah both are going to be talking and speaking to questions, but he really believes that this is a really, really important time to be talking about bees and generating these conversations. And those conversations come from questions that you're asking. And so this is something that is valuable, hopefully to us, but also very valuable to them as researchers, to both Sarah and to Dr. Frankie. So of course, we would default to saying Dr. Frankie has the book that Sarah was talking about. He's written a number of publications, but this California Bees in Blooms is a fantastic. Bees in Blooms is a fantastic way to be looking at some of the behaviors and just really detailed images of the bees. A number of different ones, and then their preferred flowers and their seasons and things like that. So it's a good launch point when you're looking at both bees and also bee populations and also different blooms in California. But I'll let you speak a little further to that, Dr. Frankie.
Yeah, we welcome your questions, and we can fine tune some of this information that Sarah's presented very nicely to you. So let us know if you have some questions, and we'll be happy to try to answer them.
Are there any other publications that you would suggest for IDing bees in California or in the Bay Area specifically?
Well, a number of organizations produce lists, and it has to do with their experiences. And our experience with California is we've sampled all over the state, and that's what our book is based on, both Northern California and Southern California. So these are starting points, really, because we sampled what was there, and through time, we've learned that there's a lot more plants out there that people can use to attract bees and to provide them with pollen and nectar. So this is an ongoing process of still learning. I mean, we have thousands of plants in California. I mean, if you look at the Sunset Western Garden book, you can see how many we have. And a lot of those plants are not listed, at least in our literature, but we've also learned that many of them that we're still discovering are very good for plants, very good for bees. And one in particular that I'll call to your attention that we've been working with recently is the African blue basil. And it's not an easy plant to find, but some nurseries, particularly Annie's in Richmond, has it. And it's an exceptionally good plant for, if you really want to see a lot of bee activity, that's a good one to start with. But there are many others as well, though. But this is just one that we didn't list in our book, but it's one that's come to our attention, and we think that's a really good one for people to be focusing on a little bit.
We have a number of questions about both bee boxes and also bee houses, and then also the bee hotel. And I know you have a lot to say about that. It's a couple of questions about, whether bee houses are a good idea, sort of the placement of those, and your thoughts on bee hotels.
Well, Sarah already mentioned that if you're going to use bee hotels or bee condos, there's a lot of responsibility that, at least as a biologist and as a conservationist, that we assume. And I say that because when you make bee hotels, you're drilling little holes into logs or into sticks or whatever. And you're going to attract not only bees, but you're also going to attract beneficial wasps, some beneficial flies. You're really creating habitat that's going to draw in a lot of different kinds of organisms. And they don't all have the same kinds of life cycles. So when we talk about, or when you read literature that says clean these once in a while, be really cautious about cleaning, because you could actually be killing the bees if you're not paying attention to their life cycle. Personally, I have used these nests everywhere where we've studied, and I like to put them back out in the wild and just let the wild take over after a year or two. I don't like to clean them out personally, but if you have to clean them and you're a cleaning kind of person, then you have to do it. But otherwise, I recommend that you just put these out someplace where they won't bother anybody and get some new ones. Because of this responsibility, and because you actually may be killing some bees. And I say this also because bees have a capacity for holding over more than 1 or 2 years if the conditions are not right. And right now we have drought in California. So there's a lot of bees that aren't coming out. They're just waiting for the conditions to change. And in waiting, they're down there. And if you disturb them, you could actually cause more harm than good in using these bee hotels. So be cautious and be careful.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions about if there are any good maps. Can you speak to any specific bees that we would be seeing that are more native to right where we are on the coast? And if we could tie any different species to different ecosystems and climates, and if there's any good maps of what kinds of bees to expect in Santa Cruz area and San Mateo.
Well, that's a good question. And we actually have worked in specific areas a little more intensively. For example, we work in Sonoma, and we also have worked in the Hopland area, the Hastings area, and now we're working more intensively in the avocado regions of Ventura. So we're generating these lists, and if people want these lists, we can send them to them. But I must caution you, people ask us give us a list of the bees of this particular area. So we send them a list, and they write back and they say, well, what am I going to do with this list? It's just a bunch of names. So actually, I think you have to be thinking about what it is you actually are trying to do when you ask for a list. And there's more to it than just making a list. There's a lot of ecology and a lot of interactions with people that go on as well. So we're still developing that kind of information. And our book talks about that. We also have a couple of flip card booklets, which we didn't show you there. And there's some brand new ones coming out that give much more detail and much more information about the bee ecology and people with regard to what you can expect when you put certain plants out. So there's a lot more to providing a list than just simply a bunch of names, scientific names, I should mention, because most bees don't have common names. We always tell people, we can give you a list, but it's the ecology that you really need to know about. And we're still developing that. But if you tell us about certain plants and certain things that you know in your garden that you'd like to hear more about, we'll actually write it out for you and tell you what our notes hold, because there's just so much information of the ones that we do know something about. For example, the ultra green sweat bee, which you saw pictures of, we know a lot about that bee, and we know what it likes, and we know something about its nesting characteristics. And when people tell us they've got this or that going on in their yards or in the places where they're looking, we can actually write a little paragraph and send it to them and respond very personally to them about that information. Unfortunately, we don't, if you're looking at 1,600 different bee species, each of them have their own their own ecologies. And we're just getting to the point now where we're actually beginning to put them all together and talk about them in a given area. So we're doing that with avocados. We're doing that with stone fruits out in Brentwood, and we're doing that with some of the work we do in Sonoma, as well as in Hopland. We can do those sort of things, and we're developing that information all the time. And if you keep track of information, for example, through the University of California A&R publication series coming out of UC Davis, you can keep track of what we're trying to do.
So someone was asking, Tom was asking, do any of the species of bees migrate? And are you seeing bees moving out of their usual areas to adapt to climate change?
We don't have any information on migrations. They do some migrating with bees in other countries that have been documented, particularly with honeybees, some of the other species of honeybees. There's about 11 species of honeybees in the world. We only have one here now, which has also been influenced by the African bee, which is a subspecies. We're just really beginning to put together pieces of information that will be useful for people. And Sarah mentioned that we're collecting information on the bees of these given areas where we work. We not only have all the labels on them, but we also have coded labels below each of them, and they go into a database. This database is going to be accessible to other people besides just our everyday work. So people will be able to look up information about bees based on the database, which is going to be available to everybody, especially through the Essex Museum of Entomology. And this is what's happening nationwide now, and that is that people are beginning to put their bee information and host plant information onto databases where people can get access to them. So this is a big change. You might say, well, why didn't you do this before? Well, I wish we could have, but it's really hard to get funding for that kind of work. But now it's become necessary because we're losing so many bees, and we have such a problem with bee conservation. And that's what one of the books talks about, the one called Silent Earth, which is the takeoff from Silent Spring that Rachel Carson published years ago. So it's really a difficult situation, and it's very grave at the moment. And we still don't know exactly all the things that go into climate change and how it affects bee populations. So the more we can document now, the more we can get information into a database, more people can get access and begin asking those kinds of questions that I think some of the people have asked here. The better it will be. It's long overdue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And some people were asking about how readily available your publication will be, and we'll put some link. We'll make sure we provide you with a link on our follow-up email. So for those of you who are interested in following up with the bees and
I should also mention to you that our book Bees and Blooms, they released I think 7,500 copies of this, and they've all been sold out from the Heyday Books publication. You can still get a few of these copies online, but we're in the process now of just beginning to work on a revision of the book, and it won't be revised very much, but we'll have new sections there on conservation, on nesting, on how to get involved with in communities with working with bee gardens and things like this. There'll be a lot more work that we'll be promoting that have to do with what people can do to help bees. So these are things that are going to be they're in the works right now, and we've been invited to come back and produce another copy. The original copy was published in 2014. We expect by the end of this year we should have the second edition ready.
Wonderful. We'll go through a couple just quick ones. I know we're getting close to on time here, but we're going a little over. But someone was asking that she read that some scientists discovered that some bees can swim, and she has a friend that has photos of bees swimming. What do you know about this?
Nothing. I don't know. I've never heard of that. Maybe it's a person wearing a bee suit that's swimming around. I don't know.
Bees. Okay. Okay, I'm trying to think of, and you know what I was going to say, we'll be providing a follow-up email. So hopefully, both Dr. Frankie and Sarah have talked about certainly answering some of these questions. So if we don't get to your questions and you're just sitting there wondering, is my question going to be answered? We will try to see if we can get these questions answered.
Well, let me say one other thing too, and that is that, people always say, well, can you recommend a safe pesticide? Well, no. Because they're designed for one thing. The pesticide is designed to kill insects. And now we know that even herbicides and fungicides will actually cause harm and impact bees. And they don't do it outright. I mean, they don't just kill the thing outright. Usually what happens is it alters the behavior of an insect. And it's a chronic long-term result. So you may disrupt the mating behavior. You may disrupt the orientation, things like this. You throw chemicals out there without really thinking, or because it's convenient, and you're going to kill something. This is pretty much the way it works.
What about horticultural vinegar?
Horticultural vinegar.
Yeah.
Well, if you know something about it, you'll have to tell me, because I don't know about it.
Okay. That's another one too.
But there are things out there that, people can do that if they really absolutely have to in their gardens. For example, you can use soapy water. Soapy water is a really good thing. You just have to use it more frequently to get aphids usually and a few other insects. Sometimes you have a plant that's just prone to have insect problems. We recommend highly that people just replace the plant, get a different plant, maybe of the same species or a different species. You know, there's a lot of common sense associated with this sort of thing. The chemical companies have got a lot of people programmed to using chemicals, and we have to break some of that behavior down and stop using these chemicals. They're not only damaging our environments for the bees, but also a lot of very beneficial insects are also suffering. And who knows what all these chemicals are doing to humans. It takes a long time to figure it out. And of course, the chemical companies fight you back. But we just say, if you can stay away from chemicals, that is chemicals that are designed to kill insects, please do that.
Thank you. And someone was asking actually if you could recommend, I think this might be a little bit large scale given the number of people that are here, but certain nurseries that sell plants and also seeds, but with the lens of not treating with insecticides and herbicides.
Well, I would say that we've been through this before. We work only with nurseries that can guarantee us that their plants have not been sprayed or not been used subject to systemic insecticides. And there's an awful lot of nurseries that are very wise to this and are very responsive. There are nurseries that don't care or don't know, and I would worry about those nurseries. But there are certainly native plant nurseries around. There are responsible everyday nurseries that will also provide you with this information. I think it is, if people are asking for guarantees that their plants are free of pesticides, particularly systemic pesticides, I think this puts pressure on nurseries to do something about it, and then to ask for and to line themselves up with companies that produce nursery plants that are free of these kinds of chemical problems.
Awesome.
That's what we do. I mean, I always question nurseries when I buy things that, you know, if they can't guarantee that there is no pesticides associated with it, I just say, I'm not interested in your plant.
Thank you. Well, Laura Baker she just typed a message saying, thank you so much for this presentation. And also she's been heavily influenced by your work and your book and information you've been putting out. And she's created a really large pollinator garden. And it's been a joy for her to see the bees arriving. And in addition to flies and butterflies and beetles and all of those others. So that is, I'm sure she speaks for many people who have been influenced by both of your work. There are still a number of questions, but I think we'll close off now. And I think if there's a number of questions that are remaining, so hopefully we will have information to share with you. It will come to you probably by late Sunday. Yeah, so you should be receiving this by tomorrow at some point, with a recording of this and also some follow-up information. And
Kate, I want to interrupt you 1 second here. I forgot to mention this, or I may have mentioned this very casually, and that is, if any of your members are curious about maybe a particular insect that's in their garden, particularly a bee or maybe a wasp or even a fly, they can send us a photograph and we can try to identify it. We can at least give people some satisfaction that we have a name that we can put on some of these. And it may not be to the specific species, but it'll certainly get you to the genera or at least to the family. And then you'll have something to work on from that point on. And be sure you try to get us a good photograph that's not too blurry so that we can have a little more help in identifying. But we like to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I just a couple just last sort of thoughts. Someone was asking, is it possible to come visit the Brentwood research plot, the research area?
Yeah, if you make arrangements with us ahead of time. You know, we're working at the UC Berkeley Oxford tract on Walnut Street, and we have people visiting us every so often. And if we know ahead of time, we'll be there, and Sarah will certainly be there to answer your questions, I'm sure. So we're happy to do that. Actually, we just been selected by a course on campus to introduce the students in this class to what we do as a model for how undergraduate students can become involved with research with faculty members. So we said we'd be happy to show the 25 or so students that want to come down how we do it, and also the kind of things that can be learned if you're an undergraduate and becoming more involved with research. And of course, we do an awful lot of outreach too, so we always talk about that as well.
Well, that's great, because there's a member of 4-H. Catherine was talking about it. She runs a beekeeping project, and she was wondering if it might be open and appropriate for a youth group to visit and to come in.
Yeah, sure. The answer is yes. No groups larger than 20 though, please. So, I mean, it's, otherwise we have trouble with, with the virus and also we have to keep distancing and masks and all this and sort of thing. So we ask people to be very careful, and we try to do the same thing.
And what about, can you just speak quickly to citizen science programs? Anything that just people that are really wanting to be involved?
Oh yeah, gee, that's another whole subtopic. We actually do citizen science work in Sonoma. Every year we do a bee count, and the people in Sonoma who are very ecologically inclined have asked us, well, they've asked us about 12 years ago, they said, we'd like to do a bee count. And I said, well, what do you have in mind? They said, well, we want to count bees. And I said, well, give me more information. What do you do when we do the counting? Then what happens? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you tell me that you want to do this over a period of a few years, then I'm interested. Otherwise, if we just do it once and we give you a list, you're going to look at me and say, what do I do with this list? And that's exactly what has happened in the past. So what we did is we actually worked with the Sonoma Ecology Center and a few other groups there. And we've been doing monitoring of bees with citizens for the past 11 years. Every year, the last Saturday of June, we go out because this is a good time. And we sample all day. And then we also teach people how to mount and how to label and how to prepare the insects for future deposition in the Insect Museum of Entomology. We don't do this with the idea that we're just going to toss this information aside. No, we use it for the database that we're developing. In fact, Sarah can attest to that. She works with a lot of the collections that we're making. And we select everybody we've had them as young as, I think, 15 on up to 75. Doesn't matter how old you are. If you're interested, then we can do something for you. And we get about a dozen people every year that sign up and they want to do this. And we have another group now in Marin County that says that we like what you do there. We'd like you to do this in Marin County. So we're happy to do that as long as we get the setup right. And as long as you're interested in more than just 1 year, because 1 year doesn't mean anything. It's just a snapshot. Mm-hmm. So we always tell people that we have to be thinking about anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And fortunately, the people in Sonoma knew that I was interested in longer than that. So they said, well, what do you think about 10 years? And I said, you're on. That's how we got started. But citizen science can do a lot as long as you have mentors and as long as you have people that know exactly how to set these things up and then how to take the specimens and then database them later so they can be used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, if somebody comes along 5 years from now, 10 years, and says, well, what did you do in Sonoma? Well, we'll have a database. They can actually look at that and compare it with what they're getting maybe today or that particular time, 10 years from now. Mm-hmm. So these databases are important for looking at historical records through time.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing too, I'll mention to you that databases are important for is databases, particularly the databases that we develop, all have information about the host plants. Mm-hmm. So it isn't simply just a matter of having a bee with a date and a label and who collected it and where and all that. It's that we know what plant it occurred on. Mm-hmm. And we make a special effort in our work to get the species name. We get all the plants identified to species or even to cultivar if we can do it. So there's a lot of information. I mean, some of these labels, some of these insects will have a label of 5 or 6 different labels attached to it. And there'll be a barcode underneath that you can run through the system, and you can figure out where that insect, more information about the insect eventually. So it's quite a process. And then you should probably be asking, well, why didn't you guys do this before? Well, this gets into the politics of doing research and getting money from large foundations such as the National Science Foundation, the USDA. They don't like to fund things that are only, that are only that go for 5 or 10 years. They want to fund things that get answers in 2 or 3 years. And that's been a problem. So now finally there's a new effort, just started last year, by the way, to look at as many different places where people are collecting data like we are, to be able to put this on large databases where people can actually can ask questions about the insects as well as the host plants, and can get some more information about the ecology of these organisms. So we have a long way to go. I hate to say, we're just entering into a new phase of research with bees and plants and people, which should have been done before, but it wasn't. But now we have to do it. Now we have to do it because we're losing so many. We're losing so many. I mean, the effort should be on conservation, not preservation, conservation.
In the beginning of these longitudinal studies that you're into. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much to both of you for this presentation. I think a lot of people will have learned a lot, and this is a great jumping off point. And I hope that a number of you will really look at the resources that we'll share with you tomorrow, and especially the Bees in Blooms resource. I've just kind of gotten a chance to peek at this resource, and boy, there's beauty too, just looking at these really detailed photographs. So
Kate, I'm going to make another comment. I'm sorry, but I have to do this. We have a wonderful photographer who is a specialist in macro photography, and he produces images that are just unbelievable. And this has been part of the problem in the past when people say native bees. Okay, you put them all in one big lump. No, there's all these individual bees that have these incredible ecologies and behaviors. And if we can get photographs and show people close-ups, which we've done in our book and which we do in all of our publications, what a close-up looks like of some of these bees, then people begin to say, oh yeah, I've seen that ultra green sweat bee you're talking about, which is the most common bee native bee in California. And the bumblebees, of course, everybody can recognize a bumblebee, but not everybody can recognize all the other types of bees. And the photographs, the macro photography helps to do that. And I should also mention, there's an incredible video that's out right now called A Garden of 1,000 Bees. Maybe some of you have seen this. It was done in Britain by a guy that was locked into the COVID thing because he couldn't go out anywhere. So he's a photographer, and he developed this incredible video on looking at all the bees in his backyard. But he did it in such an interesting way that is so valuable for people to get a sense for, that the fact that these bees really have interesting characteristics. He even adopted a bee that he claims that he could recognize this bee as an individual. He called it the Nicky bee or Nichi bee or something. Sarah, do you remember the name of that bee?
I'm pretty sure it was Nikki.
Nikki, yes.
Yeah.
He said, well, he'd actually named that bee, and he says, it's amazing. He says, I'm looking at the same bee that's coming back. This bee has personality. So I'm not suggesting to you that every insect has a personality, although they do, but you can get to know these things when you are able to see them close up. And he's provided that for us. And I think that's the reason why we also tell people, send us photographs, and we can actually give you the name of the thing, and then you'll be able to look it up and maybe provide you with even some more information about the characteristics of the bee. And then you'll know these things just aren't native bees, but no, they're native bees that belong to squash bees, or they belong to the carpenter bees, or whatever. So I guess what we're really saying is get to know the bees a little bit closer up and see what they look like. And photography, these photographers that can do this are providing an incredibly valuable service for us to get a good look at these things. And we fortunately have one of our colleagues, Dr. Roland Coville, is able to do this. He's also an entomologist, and he's perfected a means for being able to take all these photographs. And you can see these in our book. You can also write to us. We can also show you even more images, and you can even write to him and he will show you his images. They're fantastic.
Well, thank you. Thank you again so much, both Dr. Frankie and Sarah, for a wonderful presentation and Q&A session. And we thank you who have stuck around, all 90 of you. So a good number of our buds that are, or folks that are our tried and true. We thank you for your continued support of this program. You know who you are, and we're grateful to all of you who have continued to support this program. This is because of donation and because of people that are supporting, as we know how land trusts work. We thank you for your support at whatever level that looks like for you, and the support that you give to help us to continue to do the important work we do towards critical land conservation and stewardship, and for these native bees and for many other invertebrates and vertebrates. But we're thank you to all of you who are a part of this journey with us and who support the organization. Please look out for the follow-up email. Also, we have next month, February, we're going to be meeting Stephanie Fricci from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She's going to be talking about soil health, and I think that will be a neat sort of place to go from here, and the importance of soil health in the health of an ecosystem. And we'll be sort of diving in also specifically to habitat and also the coastal prairie we have here out at Wavecrest. We will be, Toni Corelli, a local botanist, will be speaking in March, and she's going to be talking about our native blooms and some of the information she has to update to what we've already been learning about from her, a number of months ago. So I think that's a great place to, as for those of you who are really interested in planting and that, the native plants and that relationship. I saw a couple of questions that were in this Q&A about native plants and that connection to bees. She'd be a great person to also to have that conversation with. So thank you again, all of you who are here, and we will see you all in just a little bit over a month, about 6 weeks. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.